Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, saying what an absolute pleasure it is to see so many of you here in this lovely small packed room. Of course, my subject for this evening's talk is the art of melancholy. And let us be honest. Depression, the pursuit of happiness, and mental health is really some of the top buzzwords of our modern world, aren't they? Let's be honest. Even princes and heir to the throne will go on television to talk about it. And quite rightly so, this is now celebrated in our society. Talking is better than silence. But you might be surprised to know that about 400 years ago in these isles, melancholy was actually a fashionable thing. Quite odd to imagine it. But also melancholy was not just associated with just sadness in its pure sense, but also with creativity, with inspiration. And many writers dedicated treatises to it. Poets wrote sonnets describing it, and also artists produced paintings which tried to capture it in two-dimensional form. But, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not just an art historian, but I'm also, of course, a Lutenist. This is a lute, which in the 16th and 17th centuries is one of the primary instruments of the period. And, well, one thing that I absolutely love to do whenever I go into an art gallery or museum is I love to look at pictures and ask myself, what does that painting sound like? If I had that magical pair of headphones and I could plug it into a canvas, what would I hear? What mood would it be? And also, what would it have meant to the patrons of that work of art and also to the painters? And so what I'd absolutely love to do is actually start this lecture by giving you an idea of what this particular image might have sounded like. This is a painting, a miniature in fact, that the Queen owns, painted by Isaac Oliver at the end of the 16th century. And it shows as a very wealthy and handsome gentleman sitting under a tree. He has forsaken, as you can see, a beautiful garden that's behind him. Yet he wants to sit in the mud, to be alone. He has his arms folded, as you can see, and wearing a big floppy hat. What on earth is this all about? You might ask yourself. Well, this, ladies and gentlemen, is a melancholic, a malcontent. And indeed, he is being portrayed as such, really to show off his melancholy. And now what I'd like to do is to play you a piece of music that almost taps into this idea perfectly. One of the things about lute music and lute song of this period is, well, how often these pieces are incredibly miserable, in truth. And one act is almost prized in lute song more than any other, and that is the act of crying, of tears. And indeed, this piece of music I'd love to play is entitled Go Crystal Tears, which evokes many different images in its lyrics. Indeed, the idea that tears can be crystal, a very valuable object, of course, in this period. Artworks can be carved out of it, but also that tears are beautiful. They have this effect on us as human beings. It really, I think this music and this art really comes to the heart of what it is to be human. And also that they have magical powers. Tears can revive flowers. They can also melt ice and melt hearts too. You'll be glad to know I'm not a very good singer at all, but I brought along a friend who's rather good at it. I'd like to introduce Faith Waddle, who's a Scottish soprano based in London, and we're going to perform a wonderful lute song which captures the spirit of this painting, entitled Go Crystal Tears.
Go crystal tears, like to the morning showers, and sweetly weep into my lady's breast. And as the dews revive the let your drops of pity be addressed to quicken up the thoughts of my desert, which sleeps to sound whilst I from her depart, to quicken up the thoughts of my desert, which sleeps to sound whilst I from her depart. Haste, restless eyes, and let your burning breath dissolve the eyes of all injured heart, whose frozen rigor, like forgetful death, feels never any touch of my desert, yet sighs and tears to her I sacrifice, both from a spotless heart and patient eyes, yet sighs and tears to her I sacrifice, both from a spotless heart and patient eyes.
Well, that's a first, isn't it? But, ladies and gentlemen, melancholy is a beautiful thing, as almost an aesthetic we should aspire to, has a very interesting and very long history. But particularly in Britain, and also in Europe in many ways, it can't be disassociated with one particular text, and that is an absolutely enormous book that was published in 1621 by Robert Burton, which was entitled The Anatomy of Melancholy. Indeed, he dedicated over 1,000 pages to describe all of the different aspects of melancholy, how to look at it, and as the word suggests, anatomy, to almost take it apart, but also exactly how to remedy it. The frontispiece, the title page that I have here, really is a beautiful thing in itself. And really, from the start, we should also ask ourselves, well, what was the melancholy that Robert Burton knew? And that was, of course, a Homeric one. In this period, it was believed that the body is split between four parts, four humours, and that melancholia, you might know, derives from the word, or the Greek word, for black bile. And black bile, melancholy, is a part of us as much as any other part is, alongside blood, phlegm, and yellow bile. And actually, it's an intrinsic part of us, and we get sick when all of these humours are out of balance. And that really Burton's work was trying to encourage us to learn. There are certain aspects of the frontispiece that I would just like to show you. Two figures on the top and the left, which I have close-ups of here. The Immorato, the young man, who is a scorned lover. And can you see which objects he has around him? His books, and also at his feet, his music. These are objects of his vanity, we are told, to show that through his melancholy, his entire attentions are of creating music, art, again, some aspects that we might not associate with melancholy. We have Democritus, the laughing philosopher, who laughs and scorns the world for its folly. And it looks remarkably similar, doesn't it, to that initial miniature that we saw by Isaac Oliver of a young man sitting under a tree, really trying to find solitariness. And Burton's book is a fascinating text. It combines medicine, psychology, and also theology and many other things to try and give us ways to work through melancholy, to actually work with it. It is also surprisingly modern. We know that he absolutely adored the idea that the body and the spirit and the soul, these are all combined. Of course, to us today, psychology is almost an art form in itself, isn't it? That often doesn't connect with things like exercise. But in the early 17th century, exercise, going out into the open, like this gentleman is, was all part of what could be prescribed to cure melancholy. This, in fact, is a frontispiece by Adrian van der Ven that was used to really as almost a forethought between for a very popular Dutch poem which was describing a gentleman, a very wealthy man, trying to cure himself of melancholy. So the first thing he does is he gets away from the corrupt air of a city. And it's incredible to imagine that Burton associates smells and nastiness and the smell of a city, the air, the corrupted air with melancholy, and encourages people to go outside. We, of course, might consider this worthwhile and clever to do today, of course. And also in pursuit of water. Melancholia is associated with dryness and coldness. So, of course, in the Homeric way, you need to go and find bodies of water to cure yourself of this problem. But also, he has brought something else with him, hasn't he, in this engraving? Can you see it? He's brought his lute with him. And ladies and gentlemen, music was one of the most important aspects of almost remedying oneself with melancholy, which I would particularly like to talk about for the remainder of the next few minutes. Indeed, in this period, and Burton would say that physicians, doctors, would actually prescribe the playing of music to those who would come into their surgeries with illnesses, that it has the power to exhilarate a sorrowful heart, to divert those fixed intent cares and meditations, which in this malady so much offend. And really, to understand what music and its power that it had in this period, we also must understand a bit about classical mythology too. Great myths actually really highlight important truths, don't they? And in Ovid's Metamorphoses, one tale is most associated with music and its powers more so than anything else, and that was the tale of Orpheus. Orpheus had a beautiful wife, Eurydice, who had the great unfortune of being bitten by a snake on the foot, and so she is dragged to the underworld. And Orpheus, the brave gallant that he was, decides to go and get her back. And Orpheus has something special about him. He has a secret weapon. He's a musician. He can play the lyre, he can play the lute. And into the underworld he goes and meets lots of nasty demons and ghouls along the way. But because he can play his instrument and his music so divinely, they all let him pass. And he even has an audience with Pluto himself, the keeper of the underworld, whose playing, Orpheus' playing, is so beautiful and so outstanding that he starts to cry tears of lead and decides to give him his wife back, which is great news, isn't it? But there was a condition, of course, to all of this, that he must walk out of the underworld without looking back, and if he did, then his wife would be dragged away in front of him. And guess exactly what Orpheus did meters from exiting. He looked back and saw his wife being dragged away. And indeed, Orpheus then started to play his music out in the open. And so divine, so beautiful was it, that all of the animals of the world start to gather around him. We see painters doing this absolutely all the time, such as in this picture by Savary. And one of the things that this tale explains is that music has this power, this very unnatural power to appeal to our senses, but also to move us in a way that text or even images can't. And And so this is what we definitely have to have in mind whenever we see, I think, music being played in this period, in artworks like this. And even we're told in some interpretations of the scene that wolves and lambs will lie together, so content are they by music's power. And even trees will uproot themselves to listen to music and to observe its powers, which is quite fanciful, but a wonderful story. Nonetheless, I hope you will agree. And then, ladies and gentlemen, when we see music being played in pictures like this, unfortunately Hollywood has done an awful disservice to instruments and music like this. And whenever we see lutes, we often think of jolliness, don't we? But great artists use this convention of playing music to oneself or to other people to soothe hearts and to soothe melancholy absolutely all the time. And one of the most important painters, of course, who did this was none other than the great Caravaggio. Here in this painting by Caravaggio in the Hermitage, we see a youth. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether it's a male or a female musician, although it is now believed by some scholars to depict the famous castrato. You all know what that means, don't you? Go back home and look it up for yourselves. And indeed, to make that point, lots of this lute music that was written for men to sing actually was in this high female register, falsetto. That it almost has a very ethereal sound, very different to men singing in tenor or bass. But with that wonderful attention to detail in this painting, we can actually tell exactly what music Caravaggio is intended for us to hear. Let's go closer. There are a few details that we can notice. Do you see there are fruit gathered in the corner? Well, if you look closely enough, you can see that they're bruised, they've been scratched, they're starting to rot. Even if you look closely enough, you can see that one of the ribs of this young player's lute is broken, which would have rattled and made an awful, awful sound. And with that phenomenal attention to detail, Caravaggio has even painted the exact piece of music that this musician was playing. We can identify it specifically with a song written by the composer Jacques Arcadel, which is about what exactly? Well, it's all about being scorned by a lover and being so upset with them that you have started to literally burn and are appearing in front of them, being consumed by fire, little by little. So melancholy, the idea of suffering, is really what mood that this particular painting is trying to express to us, without a doubt. We also see other painters using this convention to show us young men doing exactly this. Burton tells us that it's often young men who are mostly associated with melancholy because, well, when they're young, they try and be Orpheus. They try and go out into the world and find a lover whose heart to melt, and it doesn't always go so well, does it? Look at this chap. He's obviously a fashion victim, isn't he? He's also wearing a feather in his cap. Feathers are the symbol of flippancy and youth, that when we're young we blur around in the wind without a direction. And also it's so well painted that I know that he's playing a C minor chord. So again, it's a melancholic piece of music that he's playing. He's not some sort of silly court jester that Hollywood might like us to believe that is associated with these sorts of figures. And also when we see music being played in quiet and very dark interiors by the Dutch old masters, we are reminded of exactly how this music was often meant to be played in very intimate scenarios. What we're doing here tonight is absolutely historically inaccurate. You need to go to a room like this with lots of hard surfaces to hear this music at its best. And indeed here we see a lady even tuning her instrument. That idea of trying to find the right note. And her gaze, of course, is completely out of the room, isn't it, in this painting by Vermeer? Because she's not interested in us. She's probably pining someone who's off travelling somewhere, as the map in the corner might suggest. But also, the idea of accepting death as an absolute inevitability of life is also what characterises the search of melancholy in this period. In so-called vanitas paintings, which are essays on the transience of life, of how, for example, in this picture, we can go our entire lives collecting wonderful and very valuable objects, not just in the literal sense, but in in many other ways too. Yet, of course, the skull at the centre is to remind us that all of these will one day have to leave behind. And Burton mentions this specifically, this idea of accepting the inevitability of death. Life is a preparation for it, rather than in our own modern world, for example, where medicine and technology gives us this opportunity or the desire to live forever. And indeed here we can even see it, you see the lamp there has just been extinguished. And even in some Dutch poets describe that life is as short as a note played on a lute, or even a flute or a recorder, that first it sounds but dies away quickly. And here in this particular still life of Vanitas by Peter Klaus, we see objects again relating to all of the world's joys: gambling, drinking, contracts, work, timepieces, all the things that we associate with busyness, yet we will all one day have to leave them. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to finish with this beautiful miniature, which is in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam by Nicholas Hilliard. And it shows us another gallant young gentleman who, as you can see, has decided to lie once again in an open shirt, in the dirt, in the mud. And also it's interesting to see exactly where he's sitting. It's a very odd arrangement of a wilderness on one side and a beautiful garden and lawn on the other. And you might not believe it, but Burton tells us exactly what the melancholic is like and what attributes he has. And it's actually a lot to do with invention too. In other words, Burton tells us that if he is born under Saturn, of course, astrology is important, he will be predominant in the cause of melancholy in his temperament, then shall be very austere, sullen, churlish, black of colour, profound in his cogitation, full of cares, miseries, and discontents. Yet he will delight still in husbandry, in woods, in orchards, gardens, rivers, fish ponds, pools, dark walks, and their thoughts of the melancholic will turn to plans of building, planting trees, tilling fields, effectively to be a gardener. And I'd like to end my presentation now with a final performance of a piece of music that I think makes this point absolutely perfectly, that life is a bit like a garden, and particularly a maze, and that in life we have to decide which route to take us. It might be the right one, it might be the wrong one, but it's our choice to make. And so when you next see these images which feature not only a melancholic gentleman, but what's surrounding them, I hope it will make you think more about what does that picture sound like. So I'd like to invite Faith up once more.
Wandering in this place as in a wilderness, as in a wilderness, as in a wilderness. No comfort have I, nor yet assurance. Desolate of joy, desolate of joy, desolate of joy, desolate of joy, replete with sadness. Wherefore I may say, O Deus, Deus, non est dolor sicut dolor meus, non est dolor sicut dolor, non est door.